Hey strangers, there's one thing we know for sure as business owners ourselves. The less your business spends, the more margin you keep. But today, everything costs more. So, smart businesses are graduating to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one proven platform, helping you reduce IT costs, maintenance costs, and manual errors. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move to NetSuite. Backed by popular demand, NetSuite has extended its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program for a few more weeks. Head to netsuite.com/strange. netsuite.com/strange.
Hey, true crime fans! Tired of ads interrupting your gripping investigations? Good news. With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. After all, ads shouldn't be the scariest thing about true crime. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free-true-crime. That's amazon.com/ad-free-true-crime to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Hey strangers, we have started a Substack. It's a fun little newsletter, but one where you can comment and interact with other lovers of the weird. There we're going to tell in written form stories that aren't quite long enough for the podcast, but that we have been itching to share with you. Most of the posts on the Substack will be available for paid subscribers, but there will always be tidbits and news available for everyone. So, please, take a second to subscribe to our Substack right now so that you can keep up. The link is in our show notes. Now, on with the show. I'm Laurah Norton, and this is One Strange Thing, the show where we search the nation's news archives for stories that can't quite be explained. As we gear up for our 4-year anniversary, thanks for going steady with us for so long, strangers. We're bringing you some of our most requested episode topics. The next 3 releases will be stories that you all, sweetly and politely of course, have never stopped asking us to do. Up first to the plate is one of our very favorite portmanteaus, the Jackalope, aka a horned jackrabbit. It is truly an American monster, in that it is an absolutely grotesque mashup of things that should very certainly not be combined, but are nonetheless incredibly appealing. As a country, we are fond of that approach, the turducken, for instance, or a Taco Bell that is also a KFC. We crave adventure, and it is terrible and beautiful. According to the town of Douglas, Wyoming, which is the official home of the jackalope, this creature comes with a very colorful legend. Here are just a few of its excerpts. Quote, "The jackalope is the result of an auspicious mating of the jackrabbit and a now extinct pygmy deer, initially encountered by Jack Coulter, the first known mountain man to explore the Yellowstone region. Though their range once spread across much of the American West, their only remaining range is in the vast high plains surrounding Douglas. These antlered creatures are otherwise similar in appearance to a jackrabbit, yet capable of speeds of up to 90 miles per hour. They only breed during lightning flashes. They are known for their other unique characteristics, their fondness for whiskey, and their uncanny ability to mimic human sounds. This latter quality is often demonstrated by their mimicking of the singing of cowboys around the campfire, and has often aided them in eluding potential captors by calling out, 'Oh, there it goes,' to divert them in the wrong direction." Strangers, this description goes on for quite a while, including details regarding the milking of a jackalope and hunting licenses which are issued for only a few hours once a year, and a lot of other information that we would honestly be here all day explaining. And in any case, absolutely none of this is backed up by anything. But we think you'll agree, it is a fantastic backstory. Now, Despite this excellent material provided by the great town of Douglas, calling the jackalope a cryptid is perhaps pushing things more than just a bit, in that we don't think that at this late date anyone actually believes in them. To be perfectly honest, we believe it's fair to say that the whole thing started as a joke. But, as things do, it caught on and became a bit more complex. With that said, we'll toss it into the pantheon for posterity, because it has become quite the tale. So, if you're a true fan of the weird, you're probably familiar with the visual concept of this creature. As we stated, it's a jackrabbit, which is really a hare, with horns like an antelope's. Well, kind of like an antelope's. It depends on the model. When we say horns, the definition is wide. You've no doubt seen illustrations or even photos of alleged jackalopes. Some versions have perfectly scaled little protrusions that would allow their bunny owners to leap happily through the fields and plains. Others would, truthfully, be carrying antlers so massive that their poor heads would pop clean off. Look, we're not trying to be morbid here, but you cannot give a hare a pair of antlers the size of bicycle handlebars and expect that it will bear the weight with aplomb. The fatality rate would be monumental. But that is the beauty of the supernatural, right? We suspend disbelief, and the jackalope speeds off across the plains, big ol' horns and all, singing its cowboy song. We have to pause here because we know that someone out there is already beginning to write a long email full of corrections. We're using horns, antlers, jackrabbit, hare, bunny, and all kinds of words in this episode that you know in your heart are not synonymous. And while you would very much like to let us know right now how wrong we are about that, we promise there is good reason for it. Yes, hares and rabbits are distinct species. We know that American antelopes, the pronghorn variety, have horns, and that antlers belong to animals like moose and deer and the like. Please, do not press send. Just listen. We will get there. Okay? Okay. Moving on. The jackalope, as a concept, hit the American consciousness in the early part of the 20th century. However, as with pretty much every other cryptid we have covered, there are echoes of a horned hare or rabbit in much older myths, science, and traditions. For instance, according to the High Country News, medieval and Renaissance scholars across Europe wrote about varying types of horned hares, as did a 13th century Persian naturalist. Multiple sources note that variants of the creature appeared in indigenous Central American legend and Bavarian folklore. So, there is certainly some precedent for this idea. But, for the purposes of this story, we want to begin in the 1930s. Despite the brilliant backstory provided by the Douglas, Wyoming website, it seems the creature was actually born when the young Herrick brothers burst onto the national scene with, yes, a jackalope. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say, a lot of jackalopes. So, according to the Los Angeles Times, Douglas Herrick and his brother Ralph were from Douglas, Wyoming. We know that's a lot of Douglases for one sentence, but stick with us. And the boys were teaching themselves taxidermy. Per the High Country News, they'd been learning the skill through mail-order guidebooks, which we assume was kind of like watching YouTube videos, but far less efficient. Anyway, that matters because they'd been practicing the skill for some time. One day in 1932, the brothers went hunting. Ralph reckons he was 10 and his brother was 12 at the time. According to the LA Times, Ralph said that they snared a jackrabbit and they brought it back to their makeshift taxidermy shop. In what we consider to be disarmingly gruesome detail, Ralph recounted that, quote, "We just throwed that dead jackrabbit in the shop when we come in and it slid on the floor right up against a pair of deer horns we had in there. It looked like that rabbit had horns on it." Per the New York Times, it was then that inspiration struck Douglas. He was said to have looked at his brother and cried, "Let's mount that thing." And strangers, they did. They created a jackrabbit with horns, and somewhere along the way, christened it the Jackalope. Because, really, any other combination of words just doesn't have quite the same ring, does it? This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Whether you love true crime or comedy, celebrity interviews or news, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue. And guess what? Now you can call them on your auto insurance too with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. It works just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. Get your quote today at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
علي الحماس مع منيو بيتزا هات ماي بوكس الجديد. 4 خيارات ماي بوكس تعدلها على كيفك وزيد عليها اختيارات ما لها حدود. اطلب ماي بوكس اليوم وخليها على ذوقك. بيتزا أو ملت كله بكيفك. وطلباتك الجانبية اختر 2 أو مشروب. خياراتك ما تنتهي. هي شروطك وأحكامك اللي ترضي ذوقك. منيو بيتزا هات ماي بوكس الجديد بشروطك وأحكامك. بيتزا هات اطلب اليوم.
So, as we were saying, the Herrick brothers mounted their creatively morbid creation. We should add for the sake of accuracy that, as Ralph told the Aberdeen American News in 1995, they actually used deer antlers instead of antelope horns. That was what was lying around on the table, but no one ever let that get in the way of a good story. And they didn't stop there. After they were finished, they decided to move into the next natural stage of American ingenuity, commerce. According to the High Country News, quote, the brothers sold the now legendary first antlered bunny for the princely sum of $10 to Roy Hall, who displayed it on the wall of the bar in his Hotel Labonte. Considering that $10 was the equivalent of roughly $230 today, it was a pretty good return for the boys. And that might have wrapped things up, in which case we wouldn't be here today. Except, of course, that was not the end. Once that jackalope was on display at the Labonte, it attracted notice. According to the High Country News, it was so popular with tourists and locals alike that the Herrick brothers began to produce a couple more here and a couple more there of the taxidermied creatures, and then a few more. Eventually, they sold their mounted jackalopes all over, even out of state. By the time Ralph, the younger brother, was an adult, he'd turned it into a full-fledged business, one that his son would eventually join and then take over. By the late 1970s, Ralph estimated to the High Country News that, quote, he had begun turning out 1,000 mounted jackalopes each year. And as you might imagine by that time, the Herricks were not the only ones in the business of creating jackalopes. Supply and demand, and the variety was pretty wide. Horns, antlers, bunnies, jackrabbits, all varieties might appear in the mix. That's what we were getting at earlier. But it wasn't just the taxidermy that caught on. Jackalopes as a concept, as folklore, spread right along with the popularity of the concrete novelty. And that widespread presence created at least some level of belief, even if it was, for many, tongue-in-cheek. Children in the western and southwestern U.S. reported growing up with a belief in jackalopes. As Caitlin Parker of Live Wild magazine wrote about her Wyoming childhood, quote, as a kid, I would always keep my eyes peeled for the horned jackrabbit, wanting above all else to spot one in its natural environment. It wasn't until I was in the 7th grade that I was convinced that they were indeed a mythic animal. It was hard for me to believe because our local Dairy Queen had a European mount of a jackalope hanging in the dining area. I was both disappointed and relieved when I discovered the truth because I had had enough encounters with jackrabbits to know that if they did in fact have antlers, they would be a force to be reckoned with. And we can see why she thought so. It wasn't just the horned rabbits produced by thousands across the region. News stories of cowboys who'd spotted the creatures on the range had emerged. It was American folklore that seemed to appear in reverse. According to the Jackalope blog, that's because the stores that sold jackalopes told these tales of cowboys who heard the songs of the mighty lopes as they rode the trails or sat around the campfire. Apparently, and we are not kidding, jackalopes are tenors. It is great, if weird, marketing. Maybe it wasn't so odd, really, when there were other tales of antlered hares in the midst of cultures across the world. Perhaps there was just something in the symbology of it all, and the Herrick family was happy enough to keep making their jackalopes. Though, as Ralph Sun told a blogger in 1990, they were not pleased when large producers kept them, quote, out of the big catalogs. After all, they were the originators of the whole idea. The jackalope became so ingrained in American culture that earnest sighting reports began to come in. Now, we're not saying that's the norm. Mostly the news coverage we turned up was tongue-in-cheek stories from Douglas, Wyoming, a town that has done an absolutely bang-up job of advertising itself. There's also the occasional April Fool's Day article about a hunter in Virginia or Texas capturing a beast. But we did find a few clippings in between the jackalope milking and legend-building veiled taxidermy ads that actually seemed to be legitimate. For instance, this sighting was nowhere near Wyoming. According to the State Times Advocate, it was all the way down in Shreveport, Louisiana, when, in 1987, a state wildlife agent made a very bizarre report. And yes, we checked the date, it was February, not April. Anyway, Jim Taylor of the Wildlife and Fisheries Office claimed that 2 hunters had shot, quote, a rabbit with 1.5-inch horns growing out behind each ear. That's what you'd have to call it, he told reporters. They were coming right out of the skull at the base of the ears. He said that the hunters, a married couple by the name of Meeks, were taking the animal, quote, by the state crime lab to have it examined. And before you ask, not that we can hear you, no, there was not a follow-up article. There were a few more scattered, serious articles here and there, mostly hunters who called in nervous or bashful sightings of jackrabbits that they swore had horns, and took some serious ribbing from their neighbors. But really, no one took them very seriously. Because, well, how could they? The Herrick brothers were very well known by then, and they'd been profiled in a dozen or more newspapers. Douglas, Wyoming was having a great time with its jackalope-themed, well, everything. And according to how stuff works, the state legislature has even considered a number of bills related to the creature. Most recently, in 2015, they briefly pondered making it, quote, the official mythological creature of Wyoming, which is both heartwarming and perhaps not the best use of tax dollars, but what's life without a little joy? Ultimately, though, there's no real basis for something that began as a children's taxidermy project, right? Well, there wouldn't be. Except for one strange thing. There are rabbits with horns. Kind of. And, as fate would have it, a scientist began sorting out why that was back in 1932, just around the time the Herrick brothers made their very first jackalopes. It might just explain the odd sightings that have popped up and why such creatures have made an appearance in myth and in the notes of naturalists across the world. According to the Smithsonian, rabbits and hares can be infected by something called the Shope papillomavirus. It can cause, quote, tumors to grow in various places on a rabbit's head and body. And, you guessed it, horn-like protrusions are a possibility. Specifically, quote, hard, keratinized horns. Richard Shope was the virologist who made the discovery of the virus in the 1930s. But Per the Smithsonian, scientists believe that the notations of the naturalists we mentioned earlier, like the 13th century Persian scholar and the European scholars of the medieval and Renaissance periods, they were referencing the very same illness. The Standard Times claims that this disease was also described in American, quote, hunting and fishing magazines in the early 1900s, which would have predated the Herrick brothers' creation. Several sources we read noted that it's highly unlikely that the Herrick brothers would have known anything about that. It wasn't a super common occurrence, but still, it's interesting, isn't it? There was a whole antler bunny zeitgeist in 1932 that was bigger than a couple of kids who had a bright idea, or a scientist trying to figure out why some rabbits were covered in little keratin horns. And maybe that's why we, the big we, find the jackalope so darn appealing. It's an absolute mashup of a critter, ridiculous, and too big for its cryptid britches. And really, how do you milk a jackrabbit? Honestly, we don't want to know. Douglas, Wyoming can guard that secret because we'll just appreciate their lore from afar, with as little skepticism as possible, because that is the best way to approach a jackalope. If you can accept the absolute ridiculousness of the whole situation and close your eyes, well, maybe you can even hear them singing. Because, well, apparently, that is something that magic antlered jackrabbits can do. We hope you'll join us next time for another real-life story from the fine print of America's local papers, from the lives of regular people, just like you and me, except for one strange thing. Strangers, I've released my first book, and it's available everywhere now as audiobook, hardcover, and ebook. I read the audio version myself. It's called Lay Them to Rest, and it's about John and Jane Doe's, my years-long experience following forensic experts around the country, and our efforts to solve the mystery of a cold case. One Strange Thing is an independent podcast. To support the show and to hear more of the entirely true and enticingly peculiar, you'll now have 3 options to enjoy 2 extra bonus episodes a month. On Apple Premium and Supercast, you can get the bonus episodes delivered to your app of choice for just $2.99. And for $2 more a month on Patreon, you'll get more fun extras. There you'll find ad-free early releases of our regular episodes, 2 full-length bonus episodes, monthly giveaways, blog posts, and occasional live streams. All for $5 a month. We hope you'll check out one of these options and support the show. There's a link in our show notes. And if you enjoy One Strange Thing, please take a moment to leave us a great rating or review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps.